today we're going to talk about ecology, and we're going to focus on food webs and the flow of energy in the ecosystem. So many of you have probably looked at food webs before. That's usually a common topic in science early on when you had a science class. However, what it really is how energy flows from one level to the next level. And so we're going to be really focusing on that, but we'll start with just getting some introductory points. So we're going to categorize our organisms in an ecosystem. And the first one we're going to have is autotrophs. Okay, auto means self, like automatic, and troph is this level that we're going to be talking about. So an autotroph is an organism that photosynthesizes. Okay, we can say an organism that collects energy from sunlight or inorganic substances to produce food. Because the other ones we see that are autotrophs are bacteria that live at the vents in the ocean. So that's another form, and they actually do a chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. And so that process counts as well. So some examples of photosynthetic organisms that you want to consider as autotrophs, or our base level. I mean, everything on Earth that you see that is living has to rely on these guys getting energy from the sun and converting it into usable energy for themselves. And remember, the usable energy ultimately becomes ATP as one of the main molecules that they then are able to run their metabolism or any process with. So some of these examples, any plant we talk about, of course, we've talked about that, phytoplankton, and so that's another example. They of course float in the oceans and are a huge source of food for marine creatures. And then any other photosynthetic organism. And there are lots of little organisms out there that can photosynthesize. The next category we're going to talk about, as opposed to autotrophs, are heterotrophs. Hetero meaning different or different from or other than, and troph, again, this level. So hetero means eating something other than yourself or getting food from the other, okay? And so they're getting their energy source from another organism. So an organism that gets energy requirements by consuming another organism. So animals can either eat plants, or they can eat other animals, or they can eat fungi, or they can eat bacteria. Fungi, they actually can, break down dead material, and many protists. So then within our heterotrophs, we can break this down even more. And so within our heterotrophs, remember, getting your energy from another source, we first have herbivores. Herbivores are heterotrophs that eat only plants, in other words, vegetarians. And these are the bottom of the food chain. So we're going to be talking about food chains, and this is our bottom of the food chain. So the next thing we have are carnivores. And carnivores are heterotrophs that prey on other heterotrophs. And these are the predators or scavengers. And so they are higher up in the food chain, and they are meat eaters. And here we have an example of a wolf. And wolves will eat lots of small rodents and other types of things like that. Next, we have omnivore. And of course, omna refers to the whole world or everything, and they will eat anything. And heterotrophs eat both plants and animals, so they are both will eat an autotroph. They'll also eat heterotrophs. They eat everything. And example, black bears. Black bears will gladly eat your fish, but they will also be just as happy to eat berries. And humans are another great example of that. Next, we have detritivores. Detritus is the dead material that you find in the soil. So you have rotting material, like after leaves fall from the tree, you will have that start to rot, and that kind of organic matter that's sitting under the tree, that's called detritus. And worms and mushrooms, they all use this material for their own, they break it down even further, and they use it for their own energy. And so heterotrophs that eat fragments of dead matter in an ecosystem return nutrients to the soil, air, and water, where they can be reused by organisms. So they're known as detritivores. So let's look at these trophic levels. Each step in a food chain or food web is a trophic level. So on the bottom there, we have our decomposers. Those would also be called detritivores. And so they they consume or get energy from already dead material. So every single level above them can recycle back into that bottom level, or the decomposers, and they are found in the soil. At our base level of a food web or food chain, as mentioned before, are our autotrophs, plants, things that photosynthesize, or chemosynthesize in the case of the vents at the bottom of the ocean. And they are known as primary producers. Primary producers is a vocabulary word you definitely should get down. So that's that base level. And that process of photosynthesis is the primary production of a food source. Okay, and those are autotrophs. I realize there's a lot of vocabulary in here, but if you can remember what is equivalent to each, or what has the same meaning, you'll do better. So, photosynthesis, think primary producers, think autotroph. Those three things go together. Okay? Then you go one step up from there and you have herbivores, and they are called primary consumers. Okay, because they consume plants. They consume that bottom level. And so herbivores are primary consumers. They are also heterotrophs, okay, because they are using some other source or other organism as their food source. The next level, they are carnivores, because it's a animal that eats another animal. And that first level of carnivores is called a secondary consumer. They can also be omnivores. So they eat carnivores or omnivores, and they are secondary consumers. And of course, they are also heterotrophs because they are using another organism as their food or energy source. And then you have the top carnivores, and those are tertiary consumers. And that top predator, top carnivore, tertiary consumer concept, that is the top of the food chain. And so we talk about that sometimes as being what's at the top of the food chain, what eats everything else below. So let's look at this food chain. It's a simple model that shows how energy flows through an ecosystem. So you start with your trophic level. You have primary producer. If you're in a grassland biome, that would be grass. In a pond biome, that would be algae. In an ocean biome, that's phytoplankton. See, they're all primary producers. They're different organisms. It just depends what biome you're in. So we add a little twist to it. And your primary consumer, if you're in a grassland, is a grasshopper. And then your secondary consumer, if you're in a grassland, is a rat. Tertiary consumer is a snake. And a quaternary, which is the level above tertiary, is a hawk. When you get to the ocean level, you can start getting even beyond quaternary, and you have very extensive, very long food chains once we get to the ocean level. So this gives you an idea of some food chains and how that's affected by what biome they're in. But in reality, many organisms will have more than one thing they will eat. And when we look at the complexity of all the different things that an organism will eat, we start talking about a food web, which is a model representing the many interconnected food chains and the pathways in which energy flows through a group of organisms. And if we're going to look at what's going on in an actual biome, we definitely have to consider the food web. You start with a food chain, just figure out what everything's eating, and then you start branching that out into a food web. And you can see all the interconnected spaces here. For instance, herbivorous insects are eaten by spiders. They're eaten by insectivorous birds. They're eaten by predaceous insects. So there's all these things that are an owl or a hawk can eat. So you can see that. Note, the direction of the arrow means that the thing that is above eats the thing that's below. So, for instance, the arrow goes from the grass to the rabbit. That means a rabbit eats plants. So you can see that a fox eats 1, 2, 3, 4 different things. So in this particular food web. And so this gives you an idea of how energy moves through an ecosystem. So you can see this is called biomass, and it's the total mass of living matter at each trophic level. And as you can see, for 1,000 kilograms of producers, or autotrophs, plants in other words, you only produce 1 kilogram of top carnivore. So that means you have a high inefficiency rate as you go up the food chain. And that means that for every 1,000 kilograms of plants, you only get 100 kilograms of herbivores. So if you're thinking of the most efficient way to eat, then eating plants becomes a more efficient way to eat. And by the time you get to a top carnivore, you're really eating in a very inefficient way. You're only getting 1/1000th of the total start amount of plants. So there's a lot of inefficiency and heat that is released, and just this energy just kind of goes out, and you lose that biomass. So as humans, you will hear some people say, I am vegetarian for environmental reasons, and the idea is that by eating lower on the food chain, you aren't wasting the same amount of energy, and you aren't requiring so much to be produced for you to exist on Earth. So that is our wrap up of food chains and food webs and how energy flows for right now.